What happens when the one who saved the company is told she's not good enough to lead it? Meet Samantha Reed, a brilliant tech visionary betrayed by her own family and cast aside after rebuilding their empire from the ground up. But instead of breaking, she builds again, this time for herself. This is a story of quiet power, sharp revenge, and ultimate freedom. Subscribe now for more stories that prove success is the best response to being underestimated. What do you mean Vanessa will take over the company? I kept my voice level, but under the table. My hands curled into fists. The chandelier overhead bathed the room in a soft, elegant glow, glinting off the silverware and crystal glasses. Everything about the setting screamed civility and tradition, but the chill in the air could have frozen steel. My father, Douglas Reid, CEO of Reid Technologies, the company I'd nearly broken myself to save, barely glanced up from his plate as he cut into his steak. He chewed, swallowed, then finally sighed, like I'd asked something trivial. Samantha, let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be. You've been essential. We all know that. But you're not exactly leadership material. I stared at him, stunned. You're brilliant with code, with systems, he continued, as if reading off a performance review. But the face of a company needs to command a room. Needs polish. Charisma. He didn't say it, but I heard it loud and clear. You're not Vanessa. She sat across from me, in a sleek designer dress and heels that probably cost more than my first car. Her smile was practiced, polite, smug. The same one she wore through most of her life, especially when things were handed to her. I had spent the last 2 years working 12 to 16-hour days, coding and troubleshooting through caffeine-fueled nights. While the company hemorrhaged money and employees, I stayed, building the software that not only stabilized operations, but completely transformed our logistics model. We went from losing clients to locking down $300 million in annual contracts. Vanessa? She showed up to board meetings with perfect nails and no notes. I wrote the platform that saved Reid Tech, I said, each word calm but sharp. Without it, you'd be liquidating assets by now. Dad gave a small chuckle, shaking his head slightly, like I'd said something naive. Then he pulled out his wallet and tossed a crumpled $50 bill onto the table. It landed between my wine glass and a cold plate of grilled vegetables. For your effort? He said. My entire body went still. $50. $50 for the sleepless nights, the holidays missed, the relationships sacrificed, the loyalty, the vision. $50 for building the very thing they were now going to hand over to someone else. To my sister. My mother shifted in her seat. She looked at me, as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't. She never did. I looked back at my father, the man I once idolized, the man I had spent my life trying to impress, and finally, I saw the truth. It had never been about performance, or loyalty, or even success. It was about control, legacy, ego. I see, I said, barely above a whisper. I picked up the bill, turned it over in my fingers once, then folded it neatly into my cloth napkin. Then I stood. Dad didn't look up. Samantha, don't be dramatic. I gave a small, quiet smile. I'm not. I'm just removing myself from a scene I clearly don't belong in. Vanessa smirked, eyes glinting with satisfaction. Sam, my mother said, but I was already walking, heels clicking across the hardwood floor. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I didn't demand fairness. I just left. And in that silence, something within me hardened. Not in bitterness, but in clarity. They thought they'd written me out. But they had no idea. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual, just like I always did. Reid Technologies was different now. A year ago, the place had felt like a sinking ship. Tense whispers in break rooms, entire departments disappearing overnight, executives bailing like rats from a fire. But now, thanks to the system I had designed and implemented, the company was thriving. Revenues were up, client retention was stable, and we had just begun to expand into international markets. And yet, as I stepped through the front doors that day, something felt off. The receptionist looked at me with wide eyes before quickly averting her gaze. One of the junior developers gave me a quick, awkward nod, then disappeared around the corner. A few others stopped their conversations when I passed by. That was new. I kept walking, ignoring the churn in my stomach, until I reached the hallway leading to my office. Except the door was already open. My nameplate, Samantha Reed, Chief Technology Officer, was gone. My desk had been cleared. No laptop, no papers, no pictures. Sitting in my chair, flipping through a glossy stack of printed reports, was Vanessa. She looked up as if she'd been expecting me. "Morning, Sam," she said sweetly, in that artificial tone she used when she wanted something. "Didn't Dad tell you? I'm moving in here. It just makes sense." I stood still, keeping my expression neutral. "What's my role now?" Vanessa gave a mock, thoughtful shrug. "We're still figuring that out. Maybe something in IT support. Or training." She tilted her head like she was offering me a favor. "Actually, Dad suggested you take a little time off. Recharge. You've been so intense lately. Maybe work on a side project or something." I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I kept my face calm. They weren't just pushing me aside. They were erasing me. After everything I'd built. After every crisis I'd solved, every product I'd launched, every hour I'd sacrificed. They were discarding me like I was nothing more than an overpaid temp. Vanessa smiled wider. "Don't worry. You'll still be involved. In some capacity." I nodded slowly, as if I understood, as if I accepted it. But inside, I was calculating. They thought they'd humiliated me. They thought I'd slink away quietly, grateful for whatever scraps they tossed me. They had no idea. I left without saying another word. That afternoon, I sat at a bare desk in the farthest corner of the office, wedged between two interns who barely even knew who I was. I didn't complain. I didn't make a scene. I just sat, watched, listened. And within a week, it became clear Vanessa was in way over her head. She ran every meeting like it was a photo shoot. She ignored the analytics, brushed off expert advice, and made major operational decisions based on how on-brand they felt. Department heads who challenged her were replaced with old friends, former sorority sisters with MBAs from online universities and zero real experience. The company wasn't just vulnerable, it was spiraling. Again. And I had built everything they were now breaking. That's when I made my decision. If Raid Technologies didn't want me, I'd build something bigger. Late one Thursday evening, long after most of the office had gone dark and silent, I found myself sitting in the back booth of an all-night diner just outside the city. It wasn't glamorous. The fluorescent lights buzzed, the menus were sticky, and the coffee tasted like burnt rubber. But this was where things began. Across from me sat three of the most brilliant people I had ever worked with. Not in some boardroom, not on Zoom, right here, back to basics. To my right was Ethan, our former CFO, a quiet genius who had balanced Raid Technologies, books like a magician when the numbers were bleeding red. He was never flashy, never loud, but he saw patterns no one else did. Next to him was Priya, our data scientist, probably the sharpest analytical mind I'd ever encountered. She had built predictive models that helped us anticipate client churn months in advance. And beside her sat Mark, the only engineer I trusted to touch my source code, without supervision. We'd written thousands of lines together, often huddled around a single monitor at 2 a.m., surrounded by energy drinks and exhaustion. They'd all left Raid Tech within the last 4 weeks. Quietly. Without public statements or dramatic goodbyes. Because they saw what I saw. "All right," Ethan said, stirring his coffee but never drinking it. "What's the move?" I pulled a folder from my bag and laid it flat on the table. Inside were early drafts of what I had been building in secret for months. Diagrams, user flows, back-end frameworks, and several pages of clean, optimized code. The next generation of what I had once given Raid Tech. But this time, built from scratch. Built smarter, faster, built for scale. I looked up. Why build something better? No one blinked. No one hesitated. They were in. The thing my father and Vanessa hadn't realized was that the core software I'd created, the one that saved the company, was only the beta. I had written the original concept long before I joined Raid. I had improved it in my spare time, tested algorithms off network, built backup modules on personal devices. And when they stripped me of access, they assumed they'd taken everything from me. They hadn't. The next few weeks passed in a blur of sleepless nights and stolen hours. Ethan secured funding through one of his private investor connections in Austin. Priya worked from her apartment, running simulations using open datasets and her own hardware cluster. Mark converted his garage into a makeshift dev space, whiteboards stacked against the walls, cables tangled like vines, monitors flickering at all hours. And me, I lived in code, refactoring, optimizing, rebuilding every single component from the ground up. No legacy bloat, no compromise, just purpose. We named it Evolve Dynamics. The name wasn't flashy, but it fit. We weren't chasing headlines. We were building tools that worked, that adapted, that learned. Once the product was stable, we started pitching, not to startups, not to dreamers, but to legacy corporations with massive operations and real logistics pain points. Including, of course, ReedTech's closest competitors. In 3 weeks, we had 3 offers. By the end of the month, we signed a $50 million contract with a global distribution firm that had once been one of Raid Technology's most loyal clients. Just like that, we were funded, validated, and ready to launch. The shift was quiet at first. One long-time Raid client opted not to renew their contract. Then another pulled out mid-term. Then another. On the surface, Vanessa tried to spin it, restructuring, strategic pivots, shifting focus. But inside, she was scrambling. I heard from former colleagues that she was firing people left and right, slashing budgets, holding emergency rebranding meetings, desperately trying to figure out why the floor was disappearing under her. But I knew. The industry had moved on. And I was the reason why. I wasn't angry. I wasn't loud. I didn't need revenge. I had built something better. And they couldn't stop it. It started quietly. A long-standing client ended their contract with Raid Technologies earlier than expected. There was no drama, no scandal. Just a brief statement citing a change in direction. Vanessa called it an outlier. But I knew better. It was the first crack in the dam. And soon, more followed. Another client. Then 2. Then 5. By the time the board started asking questions, Raid had lost nearly a quarter of its enterprise accounts. And no one could quite explain why. Vanessa tried. She called emergency meetings, issued overly optimistic press releases, and pushed for a rebranding initiative that focused on vague slogans and sleek design. "We're evolving," she said in a company-wide video, standing in front of a new logo. What she didn't say was that behind that logo, nothing had changed. The product was still clunky, outdated, and patched together with fragile integrations. ReedX, her rushed new platform, was riddled with bugs. Clients noticed. And when support tickets piled up unanswered, they walked. Meanwhile, Evolve Dynamics didn't chase attention. We didn't need to. Our results spoke louder than any ad campaign ever could. Every time Raid fumbled, we quietly absorbed the fallout. A client who left them would reach out to us within weeks, sometimes days. We offered shorter implementation times, better data visibility, and a user experience that didn't require a manual to understand. Our system didn't just work, it adapted. And in this industry, that meant everything. Inside Raid, things were unraveling. Department heads were replaced with culture fits, who lacked the experience to manage at scale. Senior engineers jumped ship. The product team was slashed in half. Decision-making became reactive panicked. Budgets were cut. Quality control became optional. The company that once sat atop the market with arrogance was now scrambling to survive. I didn't gloat. I didn't talk to the press. I didn't so much as like a single comment on social media. I just watched the market shift, slowly but steadily, until the scales tipped entirely. We didn't win with noise. We won with consistency. I remember sitting at my desk the day our 10th former raid client signed with us. My inbox dinged, and there it was. Another contract. No fanfare. Just a simple message: we're ready to move forward with Evolve. A year ago, I was shoved into a back room and told to take some time off. Now, we were taking their business one signature at a time. That same afternoon, I received a brief email from an analyst at one of the top market research firms. The subject line read, "The new power player in logistics tech." Attached was a draft report placing Evolve in the top 5 companies to watch in 2025. At the bottom, in a small footnote, was a single sentence: "Former CTO of Raid Technologies, Samantha Raid, leads the company." I leaned back in my chair, glanced out the window, and smiled. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I no longer needed to prove anything. The market had spoken for me. Raid Technologies had underestimated me. Now they were becoming a footnote in my story. And my story was just beginning. 6 months after we signed our first major contract, I stood on stage in a ballroom lit with crystal chandeliers, looking out over a sea of the most powerful executives in the industry. It was the Tech Innovators Gala, an invitation-only event held annually in Manhattan, where deals were whispered over bourbon and reputations made or broken over dinner. This year, the spotlight was mine. I hadn't campaigned for it. I hadn't hired PR. The nomination came quietly from clients, real decision-makers who had worked with both Raid Technologies and Evolve Dynamics and knew, beyond doubt, which one was built on substance. The selection committee called it a unanimous choice. I nearly declined. Public recognition had never been the goal. But something inside me whispered that this moment mattered. Not to prove anything, but to close a chapter. The host's voice filled the hall. This year's Visionary Award goes to Samantha Raid, founder and CEO of Evolve Dynamics. Her innovations have transformed logistics infrastructure, setting a new standard for automation, scalability, and ethical technology leadership. Applause thundered across the room. I walked to the podium slowly, heels silent on the marble floor. Light bounced off the chandeliers, off the gold trim of the walls, off every camera flash aimed my way. But none of it mattered, because as I reached the center of the stage, my eyes scanned the crowd for 2 familiar silhouettes. And there they were. Near the back, at a table that no longer bore their name, sat my father and my sister. Douglas Raid, once the patriarch of an empire, looked like a man trying to shrink into his seat. He wasn't wearing the bold suits he used to favor. Tonight he wore a simple dark blazer, as if hoping to blend into the woodwork. His once commanding presence had faded. Vanessa sat beside him, sharp and polished as ever, but even from a distance, I could see the tension in her jaw. She clapped, but it was mechanical. Her eyes never met mine. I took a breath, not for courage but for peace. Then I spoke. I kept my speech short and steady. I talked about building with purpose, leading with integrity, and the power of resilience. Not as a buzzword, but as a daily act. I thanked my team for believing in something when no one else did. I thanked the clients who saw value in what we created. I didn't mention Raid Technologies. I didn't have to. Afterward, the room buzzed with congratulations, champagne, and speculation. I took photos, shook hands, answered questions from journalists. I was midway through a conversation with a venture capital partner when I saw them walking toward me. My father came first. He walked slowly now, as if every step carried weight. Vanessa followed, her expression unreadable. For a second, I thought she might turn around, but she didn't. "Samantha," my father said quietly. "You were impressive up there." "Thank you," I replied, voice calm. He hesitated. "We've had a hard year." "You know that. Raid Technologies isn't what it used to be. But maybe, with your experience now, we could." I cut him off gently. "I'm not interested in going back." He blinked. "You don't even want to hear the offer." "No," I said simply. "I don't." You had your chance to build something with me. Instead, you built around me. Now you want me to save it." Vanessa stepped forward, arms crossed. "You don't have to be cruel." "I'm not," I said. "I'm being clear." For the first time, she exhaled through her nose, but said nothing. "I spent most of my life trying to earn a seat at a table I helped build," I continued. "Now, I build my own table." Neither of them argued. Because what could they say? I didn't need their validation. I didn't want their titles. I had something better: freedom, ownership, clarity. I gave them each one last look, then turned back to the future. They didn't follow. 3 weeks after the gala, my assistant buzzed through to my office. "Samantha, your father and sister are here. They don't have an appointment, but they said it's important." I sat still for a moment, fingers steepled beneath my chin. I had known this would come eventually. I just didn't expect it to come so soon. "Send them in," I said. They entered together, my father first. Less commanding than I remembered, his suit a little looser at the shoulders, his eyes a little duller. Vanessa followed, arms folded tight across her chest, her lips pressed into a hard, defensive line. Gone was the practiced poise and subtle condescension. Today, she looked like someone who hadn't slept in days. "Samantha," my father began, his tone measured, almost careful. "Thank you for seeing us." I gestured toward the 2 guest chairs opposite my desk. "I assume this isn't a social call." Vanessa sat stiffly, her nails tapping against the leather armrest. My father cleared his throat. "We've evaluated the state of RAID Technologies. It's no secret the company is struggling. Morale is low. Client retention is at its lowest in a decade. The board is divided. We've tried other options, but none have worked." I said nothing. "So," he continued, "we're offering you a formal leadership position. Real authority. You'd be president of RAID Technologies, with full operational control. We're even willing to rebrand under your leadership, if that's what it takes. We need you." There it was. Not the patronizing suggestion of a junior role. Not the empty titles. This time they were offering real power, real trust. And for the first time in my life, I didn't want it. I leaned back slightly, meeting his eyes without flinching. "You said once that I wasn't leadership material," I said. "That I didn't have the presence to command respect." My father sighed. "We were wrong." Vanessa jumped in. "You've built something impressive, fine. But RAID has history, legacy. We could fix this together." I shook my head slowly. "You're still missing the point." Vanessa frowned. "What point?" I leaned forward. "I don't want it. I don't want your company. I don't want to fix something I was once told I wasn't worthy of touching. I'm not interested in saving a name that tried to erase mine." My father opened his mouth, then closed it. His fingers laced together tightly in his lap. The silence between us was heavier than any argument we'd ever had. "You think this is about pride?" I said. "But it's not. It's about knowing my value. Something you never did, until it was convenient. You're seriously going to let your own family fall apart?" Vanessa asked, her voice rising just slightly. I smiled faintly. "I didn't let anything fall. You dropped it. I just moved out of the way." She stood suddenly, pacing a few steps before turning back toward me. "You're doing this to get back at us." "No," I said, calm as ever. "I'm doing this to move on. Some things aren't meant to be saved. Some things are meant to be left behind. And I've already built something better." My father stood as well. For the first time he looked old. Not just in years but in weight. In silence. In shame. He nodded once. "I see." Vanessa didn't speak again. Her silence wasn't from defeat. It was from understanding that nothing she could say would change the outcome. I stood, walked around the desk, and extended my hand. "This isn't personal," I said. "It's just over." My father hesitated, then shook it, not with pride. Not even with regret. Just resignation. Vanessa didn't take my hand. But she didn't stop me either when I walked to the door and opened it. "Take care of yourselves," I said simply, and then they left. No dramatic exit, no angry words, just the soft click of the door behind them. For a long time, I stood in my office, watching the city lights through the window. This time, no one was going to toss me a $50 bill and call it gratitude. This time, I was the one who got to say no. And it felt better than any yes ever could. 3 months later, the news broke Raid Technologies was filing for bankruptcy. The headlines came fast and brutal. Once a market leader, now on life support. How ego and mismanagement sank a 300M empire. Analysts picked apart every failure: Redix's disastrous rollout, the mass client exodus, the hollow rebranding campaign. But in nearly every article, one detail remained constant. They all traced the company's former success back to me. Not just the software. The leadership, the systems, the resilience. They called me the architect of Reed's golden years, and its inevitable successor in the market. Some called it poetic justice. I didn't comment. I didn't need to. That afternoon, my assistant slid a manila envelope onto my desk. "It's from the firm managing Raid's liquidation." Inside was the list: office properties, server farms, patents, trademarks, even the Raid Technologies name itself. It was all for sale. Everything was up for grabs. Everything they once used to push me aside was now itemized and priced like clearance stock. I stared at the list for a long time. I thought about that dinner, about the $50 bill, about the look on my father's face when he told me I wasn't built to lead. I thought about the interns I was once seated beside, the office that had been stripped of my name, the years I spent proving myself. Then I made a decision. I didn't go through a shell company. I didn't use a law firm to hide my name. I placed the offer myself. When the bankruptcy attorney picked up, I didn't hesitate. "I'd like to place a direct bid on all Raid Technologies assets," I said. "Everything, including the name." There was a pause on the other end. "Miss Raid, you understand what that means?" "I understand exactly." A week later, I sat in the same boardroom where I had once been told I wasn't enough. Only this time, the table was mine. The documents lay neatly stacked in front of me. The legal team waited quietly at either end. A sleek fountain pen rested atop the final page. With one signature, I would own everything my father had once controlled. Douglas and Vanessa sat across from me. They looked nothing like they had the last time we were in a room together. My father had aged 10 years in 3 months. Vanessa looked exhausted, her posture tense, her confidence cracked but not quite shattered. She glanced at the documents, then at me. "So, what happens now?" I smiled faintly and slid a different set of papers across the table. "A counteroffer," I said. Douglas picked them up. His eyes scanned the page, and then his face went still. "You're dissolving the company," he whispered. Vanessa reached for the page and read it herself. "You're shutting it down completely?" "That's right." My father looked stunned. "You're not going to rebuild it?" I shook my head. "I don't need Raid Technologies. I never did. But I do want something." I pointed to the final clause. Vanessa's eyes narrowed as she read it aloud. "All remaining rights to the Raid name, including trademarks, patents, and brand identity, will be absorbed by Evolve Dynamics and permanently retired." Her voice cracked at the end. "You're not just buying it," she said. "You're erasing it." "Yes," I said simply. They had tried to erase me. Now I was returning the favor, with finality, not anger. My father leaned back in his chair. "Why?" he asked, barely more than a whisper. "You already won." "This isn't about winning," I said. "It's about ending things. Properly, permanently." I picked up the pen. My name flowed smoothly across the page, not shaking, not uncertain. When I finished, I closed the folder and stood. It was done. Reed Technologies no longer existed. Not as a brand, not as a company, not as a legacy, only Evolve remained. Vanessa stared at the table, her jaw clenched. "You're doing this out of spite." "No," I said. I'm doing this out of clarity. Some names are meant to disappear. My father didn't argue. He knew. As they left, I stayed behind. Just for a moment. Just long enough to feel the quiet. To breathe in the silence of a space that had once tried to shrink me into nothing. Then I turned and walked out. And as I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing behind me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not victory. Not vengeance. Just peace. 3 months passed. Raid Technologies was gone, not just legally but culturally historically. The name no longer appeared in trade magazines, on conference schedules, or in investor briefings. It was as if someone had wiped it from the industry's collective memory. And no one mourned. Evolve Dynamics had taken its place, and then some. Our market share climbed past 60%. Clients that once held decades, long contracts with Raid now referred to us as the gold standard. Our headquarters buzzed with momentum. New hires, global expansion, a second office opening in Berlin, a research division starting in Toronto. The team was thriving, focused, fearless, and I was at peace. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't driven by rage or desperation or the need to prove myself. I wasn't reacting. I was choosing. I no longer woke up with a tightness in my chest or rehearsed my worth in my head before every meeting. I no longer looked over my shoulder waiting for someone to tell me I didn't belong. I belonged. And not because someone gave me permission, but because I built the place myself. I started hiking on weekends. Long drives upstate, no agenda. I read books that had nothing to do with business. Memoirs, poetry, even a romance novel or two. I made time for my friendships again. I even started dating someone, Natalie, a documentary filmmaker who couldn't tell Java from JavaScript and didn't care. She cared about who I was, not what I'd built. My apartment, once sterile and cold, now had life. Real plants I remembered to water. A wine rack I actually used. A dog Scout. A scrappy rescue with a crooked tail and a habit of curling up on my feet while I worked. And then, one morning, an envelope arrived. No return address. Cream-colored. Thick paper. I opened it, expecting something corporate or ceremonial. But inside was a simple handwritten note. Samantha, I don't expect forgiveness. I only hope that one day you'll understand. Dad, I stared at it for a long time. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel pity. I didn't feel much of anything. Really, just a quiet finality. An ending where there should have been a beginning. A gesture that came too late, from a man who always chose control over connection. Some apologies don't need to be rejected. They just don't need to be kept. That night, I stood by the fireplace in my apartment, the note between my fingers. I didn't hesitate. I dropped it into the flames and watched the paper curl, blacken, and disappear into ash. It didn't feel like rejection. It felt like release. A week later, another envelope arrived. This one was engraved with gold lettering. The Caldwell Hawthorne Industry Gala, formerly known as the Raid Family Gala. The same event I'd attended as a child, year after year, dressed in clothes too stiff, instructed to smile and sit still. To let Vanessa shine while I stayed quietly competent in the background. I almost tossed it out. But then I didn't. Not out of pettiness. Not out of pride. But because I was ready. When I arrived, heads turned. People whispered. Not with malice, but with recognition. That's Samantha Reed. She runs Evolve now. She's the one who bought out her father's company. I didn't need the attention. But I didn't shrink from it either. The ballroom hadn't changed, still opulent, still too gold, still filled with too many people pretending to like champagne. But I had changed. And that was enough. In one corner of the room I saw them. Douglas and Vanessa. They weren't surrounded by power players anymore. No media, no introductions, just two people trying to stay visible in a world that no longer revolved around them. Vanessa saw me first. She froze, then looked away. My father raised his glass slightly, a nod. Not of invitation. Not of reconciliation. Just acknowledgement. I didn't approach. I didn't need to. Instead, I walked past them and greeted the new host, a young woman from one of the firms that had once competed with Raid. We spoke about automation trends, female leadership, and how to build companies that don't collapse under their own egos. And when I left that night, I didn't look back, because there was nothing left behind me that I needed. In the elevator of my apartment building, I caught my reflection. Not hardened. Not vengeful. Whole. That was the real victory, not the company. Not the contracts. Not the acquisition. It was the ability to walk into a room full of people who once doubted me and feel nothing but calm. To stand where I once shrank. To lead, not because I was finally allowed to, but because I finally claimed it. My story didn't end with redemption. It began with freedom, and this time, it was mine alone. Sometimes, the people closest to you are the ones who doubt you the most. But their disbelief doesn't define you. How you rise, rebuild, and reclaim your worth does. Let their silence fuel your fire, because often, quiet success speaks louder than any applause. Have you ever been underestimated but kept going anyway? Share your story in the comments. I'd love to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that remind you your power was never up for debate.